Sometimes, those sworn to protect us become the very source of our greatest fear. A brilliant FBI agent finds herself trapped in a nightmare when a routine drive escalates into an abuse of power she never saw coming. How could a woman dedicated to justice become a victim of such profound injustice? And what happens when power is corrupted and the system turns a blind eye to wrongdoing? This is a story of resilience, courage, and the relentless fight to uncover the truth. How far will she go to expose the crimes and hold the guilty accountable? Brace yourself, because you're about to embark on a tense, heart-pounding escape alongside Agent Raven as she flees through the night from the corrupt officer, Bradley. This tale will leave you surprised and breathless. But before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if today's story keeps you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to enjoy more emotional and inspiring stories. Now let's start this journey together. The golden afternoon sun bathed the streets of Lexington City in a warm glow, its rays dancing across bustling sidewalks and gleaming skyscrapers. From the outside, the city hummed with life. Cars rushing through traffic, pedestrians moving to their destinations, and street vendors calling out with enthusiasm. For most, it was just another day. But for Raven Parker, it marked the culmination of months of relentless effort. Raven, an African-American woman in her early 30s, sat behind the wheel of a sleek, black SUV. The air conditioning hummed quietly as it cooled the vehicle's interior, but her thoughts were anything but calm. Special Agent Raven Parker of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had just wrapped up a grueling undercover assignment targeting one of the most notorious drug cartels on the Eastern Seaboard. The case had consumed her. Late nights, mountains of intel reports, countless stakeouts in shadowy corners of the city, all had led to this moment. They were on the cusp of a breakthrough, and Raven could feel it. Her team was poised to take down the operations leader, someone who had evaded justice for far too long. As Raven guided her car through the familiar streets, her sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, though more out of habit than necessity. Years in law enforcement had ingrained vigilance into her every action. Her hand gripped the steering wheel firmly, and the slightest crease on her forehead hinted at the exhaustion she felt, mental and physical. But there was no regret. The work wasn't easy, but it mattered. Raven Parker was a force to be reckoned with, a name spoken with respect in every federal office she walked into. She was the kind of agent others quietly admired but rarely complimented out loud. The one who got results. The one who worked harder than anyone else because she always had to prove something. To her colleagues, to herself, and to a world that constantly underestimated her. Being one of the few black women in a predominantly white, male-dominated field came with its own set of invisible battles. Raven had fought for every ounce of respect she earned, and even now, there were times when she could feel the weight of doubt lingering in the room when she entered. "You've got to be twice as good," her grandmother had once told her. "Twice as sharp, twice as strong. And never let them see you stumble." Those words echoed in her mind whenever the days grew too long or the cases became too dangerous. Raven carried them like armor. She had walked into rooms full of dismissive glances and silent judgments, but she always left with results that no one could ignore. It hadn't been easy, but nothing worth having ever was. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, drawing her out of her thoughts. Without taking her eyes off the road, Raven reached for it and saw the message flash across the screen. It was from her colleague and closest ally on the team, Agent Kyle Herrera. "You crushed it today, Rave. Get some rest. Big day tomorrow." A small smile tugged at her lips. Kyle was one of the good ones, someone who had earned her trust over the years. She sent a quick thumbs up in reply before focusing back on the road. As she drove, Raven's mind wandered to the sacrifices she had made to be here. Her personal life was a series of unopened books, each chapter filled with unspoken dreams and missed moments. She had chosen her career, and she had excelled. But the price had been steep. Relationships that faded, friendships that drifted, and a home that often felt like just a place to sleep. Still, when Raven looked at the bigger picture, the sacrifices felt worth it. The world needed people like her. those willing to stand between chaos and order, those brave enough to fight battles no one else wanted to fight. She had taken an oath to protect and serve, and it was a promise she never took lightly. The thought made her sit a little straighter in her seat, her pride in the work she did settling deep in her chest. The sun began its descent as Raven turned onto a quieter road leading to her office. She rolled down the window slightly, letting the evening breeze sweep through her car. It carried with it the scent of fresh rain, calm and grounding. But beneath the calm, there was always a tension, a feeling that something was just around the corner, waiting. In her line of work, that feeling never went away. Raven knew how quickly a day could turn. A moment of peace could become a storm in the blink of an eye. She had seen it happen too many times to count, and it was why she never let her guard down. As Raven's SUV slowed at a red light, a group of children ran across the crosswalk, laughing and chasing one another. For a brief moment, Raven's expression softened. The innocence in their faces was a reminder of what she was fighting for, what kept her coming back to the job, no matter how difficult it got. The light turned green, and Raven drove on. The black SUV disappeared into the maze of Lexington City streets, carrying with it a woman who had battled her way to success with grit, brilliance, and unwavering determination. Raven Parker was not just another agent. She was a trailblazer, a warrior, a protector. And though she didn't know it yet, her next battle was closer than she realized. The streets of Lexington City had started to thin as the golden sun gave way to streaks of crimson and indigo. Raven Parker adjusted her rearview mirror as she navigated through quieter neighborhoods. She was only a few miles from the FBI field office when the flashing red and blue lights lit up behind her, piercing through the encroaching dusk. Her heart instinctively skipped a beat. A routine stop. It had to be. Raven's mind darted to the checklist she always ran through. Was she speeding? No. Running a stop sign? Not a chance. Something wrong with the car? Doubtful. She always made sure everything was in working order. Still, her years as an FBI agent had taught her one universal truth. When a situation seemed routine, it often wasn't. Sign. Raven eased her SUV to the shoulder of the road, turned off the engine, and placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel. She knew the drill. Her training had prepared her for these moments, and as a black woman, she had been forced to internalize an additional layer of caution her white colleagues didn't always consider. In her side mirror, she watched the police cruiser come to a stop behind her. The driver's door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his boots shined to a mirror finish, and his movements exuded a forced authority. The reflective name badge pinned to his chest read Officer Bradley Dean. Raven's instincts tightened. Dean approached her window with slow, deliberate strides, his hand resting heavily on the holster of his gun. He stopped just short of the driver's side, his shadow falling across her door. "License and registration," he said sharply, skipping the typical pleasantries. Raven turned her head toward him, keeping her movements measured and calm. "Good evening, officer," she replied, her voice polite but steady. "May I ask what the issue is?" Dean didn't answer. Instead, his pale blue eyes swept over her through the open window, scrutinizing her like she was already guilty of something. The tension in the air thickened. "I said license and registration," he repeated, his tone colder this time. Raven suppressed the familiar wave of frustration building inside her. She knew this tone. She'd encountered it before. Officers whose authority transformed into hostility when they looked at her face, her skin, her gender. "Of course," she said, reaching slowly for her FBI badge that sat in the center console. "But I think this will clear things up." She opened the leather wallet and extended her identification toward him. The gold badge gleamed faintly in the evening light, the letters Federal Bureau of Investigation clearly visible. Dean barely glanced at it. His jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. "I asked for your license and registration," he snapped, his voice cutting like a blade. Raven blinked, startled by his dismissiveness. "Officer, I'm a federal agent, currently on official business. My credentials." "I don't care who you think you are," Dean interrupted, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're in my jurisdiction now, and I asked you for something." Raven's grip tightened slightly on the badge, her pulse quickening. This wasn't right. She had been stopped for no reason, and now Dean was ignoring her official identification. Something about his demeanor felt more personal than procedural, as if he had decided who she was the moment he walked up to her car. "Officer Dean," Raven said evenly, maintaining her composure. "I've identified myself as a federal agent. I'm fully aware of my rights, and I don't believe I've violated any laws. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to resolve it. But I don't understand." "Step out of the vehicle," Dean barked suddenly, cutting her off. His voice was loud enough to make her heart pound harder. Raven stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "I said step out of the car," he repeated, his hand shifting slightly on his holster. Raven inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain calm. The street was quiet now, but a few curious pedestrians had stopped on the far sidewalk, whispering to each other and casting glances toward the scene unfolding. She was no stranger to tense situations, but this was different. She wasn't facing a criminal in the field or negotiating with a dangerous informant. This was a man who wore the same uniform she had sworn to honor. And yet, there was no reasoning with him. Her instinct screamed at her to stand her ground, but she also knew better than to escalate the situation. As much as it angered her, complying might be the only way to defuse his growing hostility. "I'm stepping out," she said clearly, raising both hands where he could see them. Slowly, Raven unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the car door. She emerged from the vehicle, standing tall with her hands still in view. Her FBI badge remained visible in her left hand. Dean's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. The smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't interested in resolving anything. This was about control. "Turn around and face the car," he ordered. "Why?" Raven challenged, though her voice remained steady. "You haven't given me a reason for this stop, and I've identified myself as a federal agent. You're way out of line." Dean took a step closer, his presence looming. "You're resisting now? That's what you're doing." His voice rose, loud enough to draw more attention. He was baiting her, trying to provoke her into making a mistake. "I'm not resisting," Raven said firmly, refusing to let him push her into losing her composure. "But I'm also not going to stand here and let you." Dean didn't let her finish. Without warning, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. The sudden force made Raven stumble, her balance momentarily lost as he spun her toward the car. The sharp bite of metal against her wrist followed almost immediately. Handcuffs. Raven's body went rigid as shock and anger collided within her. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice filled with disbelief. "You're making a mistake." Dean didn't answer. Instead, he shoved her roughly against the hood of her car, the cold metal pressing into her torso. Raven's FBI badge clattered to the pavement, forgotten. "Resisting arrest," Dean muttered, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Thought you were above the law, didn't you?" The murmurs of the gathering crowd grew louder. Raven's face burned with humiliation as she turned her head, her eyes locking on the bystanders. Some were holding up their phones, recording the scene. Others just stared, frozen in shock. Dean's hand gripped her arm like a vice, his sneer evident in his tone. "People like you always think you can do whatever you want. Flashing a badge doesn't mean a thing to me." Raven swallowed hard, trying to control the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Rage, humiliation, fear. She wasn't afraid of Dean, but she was afraid of what this meant. This wasn't just about her. It was about power, about injustice, about the ugly truth she had always known existed but rarely encountered so personally. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into Raven Parker's wrists as Officer Bradley Dean shoved her against the hood of her SUV with unnecessary force. The roughness of his actions sent jolts of pain shooting through her arms, but Raven bit down the groan that threatened to escape. Showing weakness wasn't an option. Not here, not now. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice sharp yet steady. She turned her head slightly, enough to catch his sneering expression from the corner of her eye. "You don't get to question me," Dean barked, pressing down harder on her back. You think a shiny badge makes you untouchable? Raven's jaw clenched as she exhaled a slow, measured breath. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to call out the injustice happening right here on the open street, but she knew better. Fighting back would only make things worse. And Dean seemed eager to escalate. He was a man intoxicated by his power, a man who had decided the moment he saw her that he could treat her however he wanted. The street had grown silent now, save for the clicking of Dean's boots as he moved around her vehicle. Raven turned her head, scanning her surroundings. Across the street, a small group of bystanders had gathered. They stood frozen in place, their faces a mix of curiosity, confusion, and shock. Some whispered to each other in hushed tones, while others held up their phones, recording everything. But no one stepped forward. No one said a word. A bitter taste settled on Raven's tongue. She wasn't surprised. This was the world she lived in. People loved to capture moments of injustice, but rarely intervened to stop them. She supposed it was easier that way. Safer. Dean returned to her side, tugging her arms roughly as he double-checked the handcuffs. Raven winced at the sharp pull, but refused to give him the satisfaction of hearing her protest. Her FBI badge still lay on the pavement where it had fallen, glinting faintly under the glow of a nearby streetlight, forgotten and ignored. "You're going to regret this," Raven said, her voice low but firm. "You're arresting a federal agent without cause, and you know it." Dean scoffed, his face twisting into a smug grin as he leaned closer, his words dripping with mockery. "A federal agent? Huh? You're all the same. Flash a badge. Think it gives you the right to do whatever you want? Not today, sweetheart." Raven bristled at the condescension in his tone, but she refused to rise to his bait. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her calm stare unwavering despite the fury bubbling inside her. "I'm not your sweetheart," she said coldly. Dean's smirk faltered, his expression hardening as he grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the car. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he muttered. "We'll see how tough you were down at the station." Raven stumbled slightly as he pushed her toward his patrol car, but she quickly regained her balance, straightening her back with practiced composure. She wouldn't let him see her falter. She wouldn't let him win. The crowd had grown larger now, and Raven could hear the faint hum of murmurs from across the street. "Is she a cop?" someone whispered. "She said FBI," another voice replied. "Should we?" "No, man. Just keep recording." Raven's head burned with humiliation. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her as Dean shoved her toward his patrol car, his grip on her arm bruising. This was more than an abuse of power. This was a public display meant to humiliate her. He wanted to show her, and everyone watching, that her authority meant nothing to him. As they reached the patrol car, Dean swung open the back door and forced her inside. Raven's shoulder struck the frame of the door on the way in, but she gritted her teeth and refused to react. The small space felt suffocating as she settled into the back seat, the cold handcuffs still biting into her skin. Dean slammed the door shut with enough force to make the car shake, and Raven let out a shaky breath. The sound of the lock clicking into place reverberated through her ears, final and heavy. From the back seat, Raven could still see the bystanders standing at a distance, their phones raised like shields. Some looked sympathetic, others hesitant. But none of them moved to challenge Dean. She exhaled slowly, forcing her breathing to steady. There was nothing she could do now but wait. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The engine roared to life as Dean climbed into the driver's seat. He caught her gaze in the rearview mirror, his smirk returning. "Not so high and mighty now, are we?" he jeered. Raven didn't respond. She refused to give him anything. No anger, no fear. Nothing he could use to fuel his power trip. Instead, she focused on the street outside as it blurred past the windows, each passing building a reminder of just how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. This wasn't the first time Raven had encountered someone like Dean. She dealt with her share of power-hungry men who saw her skin color and gender before her badge or achievements. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just being challenged. She was being erased. The drive was short, but felt endless. The patrol car pulled up in front of an old precinct on the outskirts of the city. The building was smaller and less maintained than the main station Raven was familiar with. Its windows were dim, its exterior paint peeling. Her instincts flared. This wasn't where she was supposed to be. Dean opened the back door and hauled her out, his grip still unforgiving. "Move," he ordered, his voice sharp. Raven's shoes scraped against the pavement as she stepped out, and she lifted her chin defiantly, refusing to be cowed. Her badge might have been ignored, but she hadn't forgotten who she was. Inside, the station was quiet. Too quiet. Dean led her past the front desk without acknowledging the officer seated there. The man barely glanced up, his expression carefully neutral, as if he knew better than to question what Dean was doing. Raven's stomach churned. The lack of reaction from the officers here told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't an isolated incident. Dean's abuse of power had gone unchecked for a long time. The sharp creak of the old precinct door echoed through the empty halls as Officer Bradley Dean dragged Raven Parker inside. The sound seemed to linger, as if the building itself resented her presence. Raven's wrists throbbed from the handcuffs, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the seething anger simmering inside her. She took in her surroundings as she stepped into the dimly lit space. The place was a far cry from the bustling, orderly police station she was used to seeing. The cracked linoleum floors, flickering fluorescent lights, and peeling paint on the walls gave the building a sense of abandonment, like a forgotten relic of a system long past its prime. Dust clung to the air, and the silence was suffocating. "This isn't the main precinct," Raven muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the empty front desk where no receptionist sat. She glanced at Dean, her brow furrowed. "Where are we?" Dean didn't answer. Instead, he tightened his grip on her arm and pushed her forward, forcing her to walk faster. Raven's instincts screamed at her. Every alarm bell in her mind was going off, warning her that something was very, very wrong. She wasn't supposed to be here, even if Dean's abuse of power had spiraled into this senseless arrest. Protocol dictated that she would be taken to the central precinct. But this place? This place didn't feel like a station at all. It felt like a trap. Dean led her down a dim corridor lined with closed doors, each one looking heavier and more foreboding than the last. Raven's footsteps echoed off the walls, accompanied only by the faint hum of the building's faulty lights. She kept her head up, her back straight, determined not to show how unnerving this place was. Finally, Dean stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall. Without a word, he unlocked it with a key from his belt and shoved it open, revealing a small, cramped room. It was an interrogation room, but barely. A single rusted metal table sat in the center of the room, accompanied by two chairs that looked just as worn and unstable. The room reeked of mildew and stale air, and the faint buzz of the overhead light felt like a swarm of invisible insects. Dean gestured toward the chair closest to the wall. "See?" Raven turned to face him, her chin tilted upward defiantly. "This is a mistake, Officer Dean," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. "You know it, and I know it. Whatever you're trying to prove here won't work." Dean's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "You sure do like to talk, don't you? Sit down, Agent." Raven didn't move. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her any more than he already had. "Where's your commanding officer?" she asked firmly. "If you think for 1 second that this won't come back to bite you." Dean closed the distance between them in 2 strides, grabbing her arm roughly and forcing her into the chair. Raven's body jolted at the sudden force, her shoulders slamming into the metal table. A flare of pain shot through her arm, but she clenched her jaw and refused to cry out. "You don't get to make demands here," Dean growled, his voice low and threatening. "You're not special. You're just another criminal trying to flash a badge to get out of trouble." "I am a federal agent," Raven shot back, her voice sharp and unyielding. "I've identified myself. I've shown you my credentials. Everything you've done since you stopped me has been illegal, and you know it." Dean leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers. His pale blue eyes gleamed with a mixture of arrogance and something darker, something Raven couldn't quite place but sent a chill down her spine. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" he sneered. "A little badge doesn't mean much around here. Out here, I decide what happens. Not you. The door slammed shut as Dean left the room, leaving Raven alone with the faint buzz of the overhead light and the sound of her own breathing. She took a deep, steadying breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had been in dangerous situations before, negotiations with drug lords, interrogations with hardened criminals, even life-or-death standoffs in the field. But this felt different. It wasn't the risk of violence that unnerved her. It was the injustice. The way Dean wielded his authority like a weapon, unchallenged and unchecked. Raven shifted in the chair, her wrists still bound by the handcuffs. The metal dug into her skin, leaving angry red marks, but she ignored the pain. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. She had to get out of this room. She had to find a way to contact her team. For now, though, there was nothing to do but wait. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door opened again. Dean returned, a thin folder in his hand that Raven immediately recognized as a prop. There was no case against her. This was all a show, a sick game designed to humiliate and intimidate her. Dean dropped the folder onto the table with a dramatic thud before taking the seat across from her. He leaned back in the chair, his smug expression never wavering. "So, Agent Parker," he began, the word agent laced with sarcasm. "Why don't you tell me who you really are? Because I'm not buying this FBI story." Raven met his gaze with an icy glare. "You already know who I am." Dean ignored her response, flipping open the empty folder and pretending to review its non-existent contents. "Driving a fancy car. Flashing a fake badge. Must have thought you were pretty clever." Raven's anger flared, but she forced herself to remain composed. "You're making a mistake, Dean. The longer you keep this up, the worse it's going to be for you. Do you think no one will notice that I'm missing? My team knows I'm out here. They'll come looking for me." Dean snapped the folder shut and slammed it on the table, the sound echoing through the small room. "You talk too much," he said, his tone dark. "Maybe a few hours in a cell will teach you some respect." Raven straightened in her chair, refusing to break eye contact. "Respect," she repeated, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You think this is about respect?" "No, Officer Dean. This is about power. And it's clear you don't know what to do with it." Dean's expression darkened, but before he could respond, a knock sounded on the door. Another officer, a younger man with uncertain eyes, peeked inside. Officer Dean? You're needed out front." Dean scowled, clearly irritated by the interruption. "I'll be right there," he snapped. With one last glare at Raven, Dean stood and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the silence. Raven exhaled slowly, her thoughts racing. She knew this wasn't over. Dean wasn't done trying to break her, but she wouldn't let him win. Whatever it took, she would get out of this. And when she did, she would make sure that he answered for every single line he had crossed. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, and anger, she knew, could be far more powerful than fear. The air in the interrogation room was stale and heavy, like it hadn't been touched by fresh air in years. Raven Parker sat in the creaky metal chair, her hands still cuffed in front of her. The raw marks on her wrists a silent reminder of Officer Bradley Dean's abuse of power. A single flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting uneven shadows across the dull gray walls. Time seemed to crawl as Raven sat in silence, her mind a whirlpool of anger, frustration, and icy determination. She kept replaying the events that had led her here, how quickly a routine stop had turned into this nightmare. This wasn't justice. This wasn't law enforcement. It was personal. The door creaked open, interrupting Raven's thoughts. Her head lifted slightly as a younger officer stepped inside, carrying a file folder. He couldn't have been more than 30, short brown hair, clean-shaven face, and the kind of nervous energy that came from someone not yet hardened by the job. His name tag read Officer James Whitman. Whitman avoided Raven's gaze as he closed the door behind him, the metallic thud echoing in the small room. He hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, before slowly making his way to the chair opposite her. Raven watched him carefully. He wasn't like Dean. His posture lacked that smug authority, and his hands shook ever so slightly as he flipped open the folder in front of him. Special Agent Parker, is it? Whitman asked, his voice unsure. Raven nodded once, her eyes locked on him. That's right. Special Agent Raven Parker, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She emphasized every word, making it clear who she was. Whitman swallowed hard, flipping through the blank sheets of paper in the file, clearly just a prop. He was stalling. Raven noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the camera mounted in the corner of the room. Was Dean watching? Probably. Listen to me, Raven said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. You know this isn't right. Whitman's hand froze mid-flip. He glanced up at her, startled. What are you talking about? Raven leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm a federal agent. I was pulled over without cause, harassed, assaulted, and now I'm sitting here for what? A traffic stop? Whitman flinched slightly, his eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. I don't make the rules, he muttered, his voice low. That's what they always say. Raven shot back, her tone sharp. But you can decide whether or not to follow orders you know are wrong. For a moment, silence hung between them. Whitman shifted in his seat, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Raven could see it in the furrow of his brow, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if weighed down by something he didn't want to admit. Why are you here, Officer Whitman? Raven pressed, her voice softening slightly. Did Dean send you to intimidate me? To get me to confess to something I didn't do? Whitman's jaw clenched. I'm just doing my job, he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Is this really the job you sign up for? Raven challenged. To cover for someone like Dean? To let him use his badge as a weapon against innocent people? Whitman's eyes flashed with something, guilt, maybe anger, but he said nothing. He looked down at the file again, but Raven could tell he wasn't reading it. His mind was elsewhere. The door swung open suddenly, and Officer Bradley Dean stepped into the room, his towering frame filling the doorway. The tension in the air grew suffocating. What's taking so long, Whitman? Dean snapped, his cold blue eyes narrowing. You're not getting paid to chat. Whitman jumped slightly, fumbling with the file as he stood. I was just getting her information, he stammered. Dean sneered as he turned his attention to Raven, his gaze burning with disdain. You comfortable, Agent Parker? You still think you're running the show here? Raven met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm but defiant. I know exactly who's running the show, Officer Dean. And trust me, it's not you. Dean's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. He took a step closer to Raven, looming over her like a shadow. You're lucky I'm not charging you with resisting arrest, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Maybe I'll add that to the list before we're done here. Take another step and you'll regret it, Raven said coolly, her words sharper than any weapon. You're already in over your head, Dean. Dean's face darkened. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but then he turned abruptly toward Whitman. Get her processed, he barked, his voice echoing in the small room. I don't have all day. Whitman nodded stiffly, avoiding both Raven's and Dean's eyes as he moved toward the door. Dean lingered for a moment longer, his sneer returning as he glanced back at Raven. Enjoy your stay, he muttered before walking out, slamming the door behind him. Whitman hesitated at the doorway, his hand resting on the knob. Raven's voice cut through the silence again, low and insistent. Officer Whitman, she said softly. Don't let him drag you down with him. Whitman turned to face her, his expression conflicted. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Raven replied. Dean is dirty. He's abusing his power, and you're letting him. But you don't have to. Whitman looked away, his shoulders tense. It's not that simple. It is, Raven countered. You know it's right. And you know what Dean is doing isn't just wrong, it's illegal. Whitman's face paled slightly, but he said nothing. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the floor. Raven could see the internal war playing out on his face, the tug of loyalty against the pull of his conscience. You signed up to protect people, didn't you? Raven pressed, her tone softening. To uphold the law. Well, this is your chance to do that. Whitman swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he took a shaky breath. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with hesitation and guilt. "I'll be back," he muttered almost to himself, before quickly slipping out the door. Raven exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair as the door clicked shut behind him. She knew she had planted a seed in Whitman's mind, a small crack in the wall of complicity Dean had built around himself. Whether or not that crack would break open remained to be seen, but for now, it was enough. She glanced up at the camera in the corner of the room, its small red light blinking ominously. Dean was watching, and he was waiting for her to break. But Raven Parker didn't break. Not then. Not ever. The clock on the dim interrogation room wall ticked steadily, its rhythm punctuating the heavy silence. Raven Parker sat still, her mind a storm beneath her calm exterior. She knew time was slipping away. Bradley Dean wouldn't let her sit here forever. The moment he returned, things would escalate. He was the type of man who thrived on control, and Raven had challenged that control. But she wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. The door opened with a quiet click, pulling her out of her thoughts. Officer James Whitman stepped inside, shutting it carefully behind him. He looked different this time. His earlier nervous energy had been replaced by something more focused, more deliberate. His face was pale, and his eyes darted toward the camera in the corner of the room. The small red light blinked like an unspoken warning. "Whitman," Raven said, her voice low and steady, "you've got to make a choice. Right now." Whitman hesitated, standing halfway between the door and the table where Raven sat. His hands fidgeted at his sides, his breathing uneven. "Dean's watching," he whispered, barely audible. "I know," Raven replied, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "And you know as well as I do that he's in the wrong. What he's doing here, what he's been doing, is illegal. You said you signed up to do the right thing. Well, here's your chance." Whitman swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder as if he could feel Dean's shadow looming just outside the door. "If I help you," he muttered, his voice trembling, "I'll lose everything." "You'll lose more if you let him drag you down with him," Raven countered. "Dean's days are numbered. You know that. You could be the guy who stood up for what's right, or you could be the one who let him get away with this." Whitman froze. Raven could see the internal struggle playing on his face. She didn't push further. She let the silence stretch, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. Finally, he exhaled a shaky breath, his expression resolute. "We need to move now," he said quietly. Raven's heart jumped, though she didn't show it. "What's your plan?" Whitman moved quickly, pulling a set of keys from his belt. "I'll get you out of the station through the back entrance. Dean's watching the cameras, but there's a blind spot. I can take you to my car. No one will notice until it's too late." Raven nodded, already rising to her feet as Whitman unlocked the handcuffs around her wrists. The relief was instant, though the raw skin left behind was a reminder of Dean's cruelty. She flexed her fingers briefly before focusing on Whitman. "You sure about this?" she asked, giving him one last chance to back out. Whitman's jaw tightened. "Dean's a monster. I can't keep looking the other way." Whitman led Raven cautiously out of the interrogation room and down a narrow hallway that felt more like a forgotten relic than part of a functioning police station. The place was quiet, eerily so. Most of the officers were gone for the night, leaving the building dark and empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. At every turn, Whitman checked the corners like a man expecting trouble. His nerves were obvious, but he pushed through them, signaling for Raven to stay close behind. They reached a heavy metal door at the back of the station. Whitman paused, pulling out his keys and fumbling with the lock. "This door leads straight to the back lot. My car's parked there," he whispered. Raven glanced over her shoulder, her pulse quickening. "Hurry up," she muttered. The lock clicked open, and Whitman pushed the door outward, revealing the crisp night air. The lot beyond was empty save for a few scattered patrol cars. The dark sky stretched above them, stars obscured by the city's light pollution. "There," Whitman said, pointing to a beat-up sedan parked toward the edge of the lot. It looked like an old civilian vehicle, its dull paint blending into the shadows. "Let's go," Raven said. They moved quickly, Whitman leading the way, with Raven close on his heels. Her senses were on high alert, every creak and rustle sending her head darting around for signs of trouble. She half expected Dean to burst through the door at any moment, his anger a tangible threat chasing them into the night. Whitman unlocked the car, and Raven slid into the passenger seat as he jumped in behind the wheel. The doors clicked shut, and for a moment there was only silence. Then Whitman turned the ignition, and the engine sputtered to life. "Go," Raven urged. Whitman slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, peeling out of the lot and onto the empty road beyond. The city streets were quiet as they drove through the darkness, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Raven kept her eyes on the mirrors, watching for any sign of pursuit. So far, they were clear, but she knew it wouldn't last. Dean would notice she was gone soon, if he hadn't already, and when he did, he'd come for them. Whitman's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He was trying to keep calm, but Raven could see the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "You're doing the right thing," Raven said quietly, her voice steady. "I need you to keep it together." Whitman nodded, though he didn't speak. His eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. "What's our plan?" he asked finally. "Where are we going?" Raven's mind was already racing through their options. "We need distance," she said. "Somewhere Dean won't think to look right away. A motel, an industrial park, anywhere out of the way. Once we're safe, I'll contact my team." Whitman hesitated. "What if he finds us before then?" Raven turned her head sharply to face him. "He won't." The streets began to blur as Whitman picked up speed, taking back roads and side streets to avoid being seen. Raven guided him, using her familiarity with the city to navigate the safest route. Her FBI training kicked in, every instinct honed by years in the field. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. Whitman's breathing was shallow, and Raven could see the weight of his choice settling heavily on his shoulders. "You're risking a lot," Raven said after a while, breaking the silence. "Why now?" Whitman kept his eyes on the road. "Because I can't keep pretending this is okay. What Dean's doing, it's not just you. He's been doing this for years, getting away with it because no one's had the guts to stand up to him. I can't be that guy anymore." Raven studied him for a moment, her gaze softening slightly. "It takes courage to do what you did tonight." Whitman didn't respond, but his grip on the wheel loosened just slightly. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, approaching fast. Raven's heart leapt into her throat. "Someone's behind us," Whitman said, panic creeping into his voice. Raven twisted in her seat, scanning the road. The vehicle, a black SUV, was closing in quickly. It wasn't just another car. It was him. "Dean," Raven muttered. "He found us. What do we do?" Whitman's voice cracked. "Drive," Raven ordered. "Get us out of here." Whitman floored the gas pedal, the car jolting forward as they raced through the darkened streets. The SUV pursued them relentlessly, its headlights glaring like a predator's eyes. Raven's pulse pounded in her ears as she searched for a plan, her mind working faster than ever. "We need to lose him," she said, her voice sharp. "Take the next left fast." Whitman obeyed, yanking the wheel hard. The car screeched around the corner, tires skidding on the pavement. The chase was on. The roar of the engine and the screech of tires echoed through the desolate countryside, slicing through the eerie silence of the rural night. Officer Bradley Dean's black SUV bore down on them, headlights blazing like twin fireballs in the dark. Raven Parker braced herself in the passenger seat, her pulse pounding with every twist and turn of the narrow road. "Faster," she urged, her voice sharp but controlled. "I'm trying." Officer James Whitman's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his foot pressing the gas pedal to the floor. The old sedan groaned in protest as it lurched forward, speeding deeper into the winding backroads. Through the side mirror, Raven caught glimpses of Dean's SUV weaving through the curves with menacing precision. He was relentless, a predator closing in on his prey. There was no mistaking the cold resolve in the way he drove. Dean was hunting them, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The city lights were long behind them, replaced by vast stretches of darkness broken only by the occasional moonlit field or gnarled tree line. The road ahead was a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt, bordered by dense forests that swallowed all light and sound. They were far from anywhere, and that isolation cut both ways, freedom and danger intertwined. "What's your plan?" Whitman asked, his voice shaky. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his eyes darted nervously between the road and the mirrors. "We can't outrun him forever in this thing." "We don't have to outrun him," Raven said, her tone steady. "We just have to disappear." Whitman shot her a glance. "Disappear? How? He's right on top of us." Raven's sharp eyes scanned the darkness ahead. "Take the next turn. There's a forest up there. We'll lose him in the trees." "Are you insane?" Whitman sputtered. "We can't." "Do it," Raven snapped, her voice cutting through his panic. "We don't have a choice." Whitman swallowed hard but obeyed. The sedan swerved violently onto a narrow dirt path branching off from the main road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. Raven grabbed the dashboard to steady herself as the car jostled over uneven ground. Behind them, Dean's SUV barreled onto the path moments later, its massive frame bouncing as it pursued them through the darkness. The beams of its headlights danced wildly across the trees, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to chase Raven and Whitman as they fled deeper into the forest. Branches scraped against the sides of the car like claws, the thick underbrush crowding the narrow trail. Whitman struggled to keep the vehicle under control, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The dirt path twisted and narrowed, forcing him to slow down. "He's still coming," Whitman shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Raven craned her neck to look back. Dean's SUV loomed closer, gaining on them despite the rugged terrain. The man was relentless, his engine roaring like a beast hungry for blood. "There!" Raven pointed ahead. "Kill the lights and pull off the trail now." Whitman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Do it," Raven barked. Whitman killed the headlights, plunging them into near-total darkness. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car skidding off the dirt path and into the thick underbrush. The engine shuddered as the sedan jolted to a stop between two massive oaks. Both Raven and Whitman ducked low, their breathing ragged as they waited. Seconds later, Dean's SUV thundered past on the dirt path, its headlights slicing through the trees. Raven held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. She could see the faint glow of his brake lights farther up the trail as the vehicle slowed. "Don't stop. Keep going," she thought desperately. The brake lights vanished as Dean's SUV disappeared deeper into the woods, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Raven exhaled quietly, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "Get out," she whispered to Whitman. "We're going on foot." Whitman turned to her, his face pale. "Are you crazy? He'll find us." "He'll double back," Raven said, already pushing the car door open and stepping into the cool night air. "We can't stay here. If we're on foot, we can lose him in the trees." Whitman hesitated, but eventually followed her lead. The forest stretched around them like a living shadow, its canopy blocking out most of the moonlight. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine, and every sound, every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed magnified in the stillness. Raven took the lead, moving swiftly but carefully through the dense underbrush. Her training kicked in, her senses tuned to every movement, every sound. Whitman followed close behind, his breathing loud and uneven as he struggled to keep up. "Where are we going?" he whispered. "Anywhere but here," Raven replied. "Stay quiet and keep moving." For what felt like an eternity, they pushed deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees and using the cover of darkness to hide their movements. The branches clawed at their clothes, and the ground was uneven. But Raven pressed on. She refused to let fear slow her down. A faint sound in the distance brought her to an abrupt stop. Whitman nearly collided into her. "What?" he began. But Raven silenced him with a sharp gesture. She tilted her head, straining to listen. There it was, faint but growing closer. the unmistakable crunch of boots on dry leaves. "Dean," she whispered. Whitman's eyes widened. "He's following us?" "Of course he is," Raven muttered. "But we have the advantage here. Stay close to me." They moved again, faster this time, their path zigzagging through the thickest part of the woods to throw off Dean's pursuit. But the sound of footsteps didn't fade. It grew louder, closer. Dean wasn't giving up. Suddenly, Raven spotted something through the trees, a faint outline against the darkness. An old cabin, its roof sagging and walls weathered with age, stood hidden among the overgrowth. She motioned to Whitman. "There," she whispered. "We'll hide there." They broke into a sprint, their footsteps muffled by the moss-covered ground. Raven reached the cabin first, shoving the door open with a creak and ushering Whitman inside. The air inside was cold and musty, filled with the scent of decay. Dust hung in the air, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. Raven eased the door shut, pressing her back against it as she listened. The forest outside was silent again, but she knew Dean was close. He was hunting them, and he wouldn't stop until he found them. Whitman slumped against the far wall, gasping for breath. "What now?" he whispered. Raven scanned the room quickly. A broken table, a few rotting chairs, and debris littered the floor. "We wait," she said quietly. "Stay low, and don't make a sound." Outside, the faint crunch of leaves began again, slow and deliberate. Raven's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched near the window, her eyes scanning the darkness. Dean was close. She could feel it. A shadow passed across the window, and Raven froze. He was here. The cabin was silent, save for the faint creak of wood as the old structure settled under the weight of time. Raven Parker crouched near the window, her breathing low and controlled, every muscle in her body tense. The shadow that had passed moments before had disappeared, but she knew better than to think they were safe. Bradley Dean was out there, watching, hunting. Behind her, Officer James Whitman sat against the far wall, knees pulled to his chest, his breathing uneven. He looked every bit a man on the edge, but Raven didn't have time to calm him. "Not now. Stay quiet," she whispered sharply, never taking her eyes off the window. "Whatever happens, follow my lead." Whitman nodded shakily, his face pale in the faint moonlight that seeped through cracks in the wooden walls. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves outside the cabin. Each step was measured, almost teasing, as if Dean knew exactly how close he was to his prey. Raven's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. A voice broke the silence. "Agent Parker," Dean called out, his tone laced with cruel amusement. "I know you're in there. You didn't really think you could run forever, did you?" Raven's jaw tightened. She didn't respond. The footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. Dean's flashlight beam sliced through the gaps in the wooden walls, its light sweeping across the room in jagged streaks. "You're making this harder on yourself," Dean continued, his voice a low, menacing drawl. "You could have just stayed quiet, kept your head down. But no, you had to stick your nose where it didn't belong. And look where it got you." Raven shifted slightly, signaling Whitman to stay low. She scanned the room quickly, noting the layout. The cabin was small and empty, with only one door and a single broken window. They were boxed in. Dean's boots thudded onto the wooden steps of the porch. The sound was heavy, deliberate, each step echoing through the quiet night. Raven's hands curled into fists as she prepared herself. The doorknob rattled. Then, silence. The door burst open with a thunderous crash, splinters of wood flying as Dean's shoulder forced it open. He stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the cabin before landing on Raven. "There you are," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice. He took a step forward, his frame blocking the doorway, the beam of light blinding. Raven didn't move. She remained crouched, her muscles coiled and ready. "Get up," Dean ordered, his hand resting on the baton strapped to his belt. "You and I have unfinished business." "I wouldn't take another step," Raven said, her voice low and deadly calm. Dean's expression twisted into a smug grin. Is that so? You think you're still in charge here, Agent Parker? He moved closer, closing the distance between them. His arrogance was palpable, and Raven could see that he wasn't expecting resistance. He thought he had already won. Big mistake. Dean reached for his baton, and that's when Raven struck. With lightning speed, she sprang to her feet, sweeping her leg in a low arc. Her boot connected with Dean's shin, sending him stumbling back with a curse. Before he could recover, Raven launched herself forward, grabbing the baton from his grip and wrenching it free. "Get back!" she shouted at Whitman, who scrambled out of the way. Dean's face contorted with rage. "You're going to regret that." He lunged at her, his sheer size giving him an advantage, but Raven was faster. She sidestepped his charge and swung the baton hard against his ribs. The crack of the impact echoed through the cabin, and Dean grunted in pain, staggering to one knee. Raven didn't let up. She turned, driving the baton downward toward his shoulder. But Dean was ready this time. He caught her wrist with surprising strength, wrenching the weapon away and tossing it across the room. "You're tough," Dean growled, pulling himself to his feet, but not tough enough. Raven's mind raced. She'd lost the baton, but she still had her training. Dean's size made him dangerous, but his anger was a weakness. He was sloppy, focused on overpowering her instead of fighting smart. He lunged again, his fists swinging wildly. Raven ducked beneath his punch and drove her elbow into his stomach, using his momentum against him. Dean gasped, doubling over, but he didn't fall. He grabbed her arm and threw her hard against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a moment, everything blurred. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. Dean was already coming at her again, his face twisted with fury. "Raven!" Whitman's voice broke through the chaos. Raven turned just in time to see Whitman toss something her way, her FBI-issued gun. It skidded across the floor, stopping just inches from her outstretched hand. Dean froze, his eyes widening as Raven grabbed the weapon and pointed it directly at him. "Don't move," Raven said, her voice steady despite her ragged breathing. Dean raised his hand slowly, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Raven shot back. Her hands didn't waver. "I've had enough of your games." Dean took a step forward, his hands still raised. "Go ahead then. Pull the trigger. Let's see what happens when they find you here with my body." Raven's finger hovered on the trigger, but she didn't fire. "You think you're untouchable," she said coldly, "that no one will believe what you've done. But you're wrong. The truth always comes out." Dean sneered. "Who's going to listen to you? You're just another." "Shut up," Raven snapped, her voice ringing through the cabin. "You're done, Dean. It's over." The sound of distant sirens cut through the night, their wails growing louder as they approached. Dean's expression faltered, the smug confidence finally replaced by something else, fear. "You hear that?" Raven said, her voice calm again. "That's backup. They're coming for you." Dean's gaze darted toward the door, as if considering a last-minute escape. But it was too late. The sirens grew deafening as flashes of red and blue light filled the cabin through the broken window. Raven didn't lower her weapon as she stepped forward, forcing Dean back toward the wall. "Get on your knees. Now." Dean hesitated, his face pale and sweaty. But the approaching police lights left him no choice. Slowly, he dropped to his knees, his hands still raised. Whitman let out a shaky breath from across the room, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You did it," he whispered. The wail of sirens grew louder as the flashing red and blue lights filled the windows of the cabin, slicing through the darkness like a beacon of salvation. Raven Parker stood over Bradley Dean, her gun still trained on him as he knelt against the wall, his smug arrogance replaced with pale, sweat-soaked fear. The sound of approaching backup reverberated through the forest, echoing off the trees like thunder rolling in a distant storm. Dean's lips curled into a bitter sneer despite his position. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won? You think this changes anything?" Raven didn't flinch. Her hand remained steady, her sharp gaze locked on his trembling form. "You're done, Dean," she said calmly. Everything you've done, every life you've ruined, ends here. Outside, the gravel crunched under the tires of several vehicles, followed by the heavy thuds of boots hitting the ground. Voices shouted orders as FBI agents and local officers moved toward the cabin, weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the dark. "Raven!" a familiar voice called out. "Agent Parker, are you in there?" Relief washed over her like a tidal wave. "In here," she called back, her voice strong and clear. The cabin door burst open moments later, revealing Special Agent Kyle Herrera, Raven's closest ally and teammate at the FBI. His face was a mixture of worry and urgency as he swept the room with his flashlight before locking eyes on Raven. "Parker," Kyle breathed, lowering his weapon. "We've got you." Raven exhaled slowly, the tension that had gripped her chest beginning to ease. Kyle motioned for the other agents to move in. Two officers quickly crossed the room, grabbing Dean by the arms and pulling him to his feet. "Get off me!" Dean snarled, but his protests fell on deaf ears as the agents forced his hands behind his back and slapped on a fresh pair of handcuffs. The sound of metal locking into place was a small, satisfying victory. "Bradley Dean," Kyle said sharply as he stepped toward the disgraced officer. "You're under arrest for the unlawful detainment of a federal agent, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority." Dean's glare burned with hatred as he looked between Kyle and Raven. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice shaking. "You'll all regret this." "Take him outside," Kyle ordered, his tone brooking no argument. The agents dragged Dean toward the door. He twisted and shouted as they pulled him into the cold night, but his voice faded quickly as the cabin emptied. For the first time in hours, the silence didn't feel suffocating, it felt like freedom. Whitman slumped against the wall, his expression one of disbelief as he watched the chaos unfold. His face was pale, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "It's over," he whispered, as if trying to convince himself that it was true. Raven turned to him, her calm demeanor masking the exhaustion that tugged at every inch of her body. "You did the right thing, Whitman," she said firmly. "You saved lives tonight, yours included." Whitman met her gaze, his expression torn. "Dean's going to bury me for this," he said softly. "Even if he's locked up, guys like him, they have their ways." "Not this time," Raven replied, her voice hard with resolve. "Dean's reign is over. You've seen how this works. Once the truth gets out, it spreads. And trust me, it's getting out." Kyle reappeared in the doorway, his expression softening when he looked at Raven. "Come on, Parker," he said. "Let's get you out of here." Raven nodded, finally lowering her weapon. The adrenaline that had carried her this far began to ebb, leaving a deep weariness in its place. Whitman pushed himself to his feet and followed her as they stepped outside, where the scene had erupted into controlled chaos. The clearing in front of the cabin was alive with agents and officers. Bright beams of light lit up the trees, illuminating the heavy fog that clung to the ground. Agents in tactical gear moved like clockwork, securing the perimeter and coordinating the search for Dean's vehicle. Patrol cars and unmarked SUVs lined the narrow dirt road, their lights pulsing like a heartbeat. Dean had been taken to one of the vehicles, his shouts muffled by the sound of radios crackling and agents giving orders. For all his bravado, the reality of his situation had begun to set in. Kyle walked beside Raven as they made their way toward one of the SUVs. "You're lucky we got here when we did," he said, his tone soft. "We weren't sure how bad it was." "It was bad," Raven admitted, her voice steady but worn. "Dean had help, or at least complicity. He thought he was untouchable." Kyle nodded grimly. "That's over now. We'll make sure of it." As they reached the SUV, Kyle turned to face her fully, his expression one of genuine concern. "Are you okay?" Raven paused, the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. "I will be," she said finally. "But this isn't over, Herrera. Not by a long shot." Kyle tilted his head. "What do you mean?" I'm not stopping until every piece of this is exposed," Raven replied, her voice carrying a quiet fury. "Dean's just the beginning. There are more like him, people who abuse the badge, who think they're above the law. And I'm going to make sure they're held accountable." Kyle studied her for a moment before nodding in agreement. "We'll back you, Parker. Whatever it takes." Whitman stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold with an expression of quiet relief. For the first time, he seemed to realize the weight of the choice he'd made. What had it cost him, and what had it saved? Raven approached him, her gaze steady. "You've got a lot to answer for, Whitman," she said honestly. "But you made the right choice in the end. That matters." Whitman looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt and gratitude. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "You cooperate," Raven replied. "You tell the truth. Every detail, every name. Dean didn't operate alone. And if you help us expose them, you'll be on the right side of this." Whitman nodded slowly. "I will." Raven offered a small nod in return. "Good." As Raven climbed into the SUV, she took one last look at the cabin. The battered structure, which had felt like a trap just hours before, now stood silent and empty beneath the glow of the patrol lights. It was a place where fear and injustice had been confronted, where strength and courage had won out. As the SUV pulled away, Raven leaned back against the seat, letting the hum of the engine lull her into a momentary peace. She wasn't done, far from it, but for now justice had arrived. Bradley Dean was in custody. The truth was finally coming to light, and Raven Parker had proven once again that no man, no matter how corrupt or powerful, could silence her. The hum of the engine filled the quiet as Raven Parker sat in the back seat of the SUV, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. The flashing lights of the cabin had disappeared behind them, replaced now by the endless stretch of night. Exhaustion tugged at her, but her mind refused to rest. Too much had happened, too much still needed to be done. Next to her sat Special Agent Kyle Herrera, his face calm but watchful as he drove. In the passenger seat, Officer James Whitman sat silently, staring at his hands folded in his lap. The car was filled with a heavy stillness that none of them seemed eager to break. "Everything okay back there?" Kyle asked softly, glancing at Raven in the rearview mirror. "I've fine," Raven replied quietly. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. In reality, her thoughts were a whirlwind, circling back to the events of the past 24 hours. The memory of Bradley Dean's smug face, his taunts, and the sound of handcuffs clicking around her wrist still lingered in her mind like smoke from a fire. She could feel the weight of it, how close he had come to winning, to erasing her identity and reducing her to nothing more than his victim. But she hadn't broken. She wouldn't. The SUV pulled into the Lexington FBI field office, its bright exterior lights casting a harsh glow against the night sky. Kyle parked the vehicle, turning off the ignition before looking over at Whitman. "You're coming inside with us," he said firmly. "We'll get your statement and figure out how to protect you. You did the right thing, Officer Whitman. Don't forget that." Whitman nodded wordlessly, his face pale and worn. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in one night. Raven understood. Crossing someone like Dean was more than just a professional risk. It was personal. The fear of retribution wasn't irrational. People like Dean thrived on intimidation and loyalty born of fear. But it was over for Dean, or at least it was beginning to unravel. Raven stepped out of the SUV, the cool night air hitting her face like a wave of relief. She glanced back at Whitman as he followed Kyle inside the building. For all his faults, he had done the right thing when it mattered most. That counted for something. Inside the conference room, Raven sat across from Kyle, a cup of steaming coffee in her hands. It was just the two of them now. The others had dispersed, working to process Dean's arrest, secure evidence, and reach out to those who could corroborate Whitman's testimony. Kyle studied her quietly for a moment before speaking. "You were lucky tonight, Parker. Dean almost had you." Raven sipped her coffee, her eyes fixed on the table. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she replied. "I survived because I refused to let him take my power." Kyle nodded. "And now what?" "Dean's locked up, but there's a long road ahead. You know that." Raven exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "He's locked up for now, but this isn't over. Dean didn't get away tonight, but that doesn't mean the fight is finished. Men like him don't just operate alone. They thrive in systems that enable them." Kyle raised an eyebrow. You think there are others? Raven's gaze sharpened. I know there are. Dean didn't become this person overnight. He's a symptom of a larger sickness. How many others turn a blind eye? How many covered for him, ignored the signs, or looked the other way? Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's hard to root out the bad ones when they hide behind the same badge as the good ones. Makes people lose trust in the system. That's exactly why we can't stop, Raven said firmly, setting her coffee down. It's not enough to take down one corrupt officer. We have to rebuild the trust they destroy. People need to know that accountability isn't optional, that the badge doesn't make anyone above the law. Kyle leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. You sound like you're already planning your next move. I am, Raven replied without hesitation. Dean's actions tonight weren't unique. There are more like him, and they're counting on silence to keep them safe. I won't be silent. Not ever. Kyle's expression softened. You really don't stop, do you? Raven shook her head, a determined fire flickering in her eyes. Not until it's done. Later that night, Raven sat in her apartment, the only light coming from the city skyline outside her window. She held her FBI badge in her hands, turning it over slowly as she reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about Dean, how he had tried to strip her of her identity, to humiliate her in front of strangers just to prove his power. He wasn't the first person who had underestimated her, and he likely wouldn't be the last. But Raven had faced worse. She had fought her way to the top of her field in a world that didn't always welcome women like her, a black woman, a federal agent, and a force to be reckoned with. She had faced prejudice, doubt, and adversity at every turn, but she had never let it stop her. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind once more. You've got to be twice as good, twice as sharp, twice as strong. It wasn't fair, but it was the truth, and Raven had embraced it. She didn't just fight for herself. She fought for those who didn't have a voice, for the people who couldn't push back against injustice alone. And now, there was another battle waiting for her. The phone on her table buzzed, breaking the quiet. Raven picked it up and saw a text from Kyle. Dean's lawyer just showed up. He's staying quiet for now, but we know he's hiding something. You were right. Raven's eyes narrowed. She typed a quick response. I'm not done yet. Let's dig deeper. Setting the phone down, Raven stared back out at the sprawling city. Somewhere out there, Dean's allies were watching, waiting, maybe even scrambling to cover their tracks. They'd underestimated her once. They wouldn't get that chance again. Raven knew the fight wasn't just about Bradley Dean. He was a small piece of a much larger issue: abuse of power, corruption, and a broken system that too often failed those it was meant to protect. Her experience was a painful reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Dean's actions were fueled by a system that rewarded silence and punished those who spoke out. Change wouldn't come overnight, but Raven was determined to be part of that change. This wasn't just about justice. It was about accountability, rebuilding trust, and refusing to let fear silence the truth. As Raven sat there, her badge shining faintly in the dim light, she made a silent promise to herself and to everyone who had ever been in her position. She wouldn't stop, not until the fight was won, not until justice prevailed. Across town, in a dimly lit alley, Bradley Dean slipped out of a black sedan and disappeared into the shadows, a figure watching from the distance. The fight wasn't over. He wasn't finished yet. What would you do if you were faced with injustice like Raven Parker? Do you think people like Dean can be stopped? Or is the system too broken to fix? Share your thoughts. And let's keep this conversation going. Justice begins with us, and there's more to this story coming soon. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss more inspiring and powerful stories to come. Your support means the world to us. See you next one.